The blue lights hit your rearview mirror before your brain even processes what's happening. 1 second, you're just driving home, maybe thinking about dinner or replaying your day, and the next, your chest tightens. Your hands instinctively grip the wheel a little tighter. You check your speed, your mirrors, your surroundings. You're already asking yourself, what did I do? And then comes that quiet moment before you pull over, where everything slows down just enough for doubt to creep in. Have you ever been pulled over and felt like something about the officer's behavior just didn't sit right, but you didn't know whether to speak up or stay quiet? Drop your experience in the comments, because later on I'm going to walk you through something most drivers don't realize about those situations, and it can completely change how you handle your next stop. Let's start with something people don't talk about enough. Most traffic stops are routine. Most officers are professional, but every now and then something shifts. The tone feels off. The questions feel unnecessary. The interaction starts stretching longer than it should, and that's when things get complicated. Now here's the part that surprises a lot of people. Sometimes the person who fixes that situation isn't you. It's another officer. You don't hear about those moments often, but they happen. And when they do, they reveal a lot about how policing actually works behind the scenes. Picture this. You're pulled over for what you think is a simple lane violation. The officer approaches and right away the tone is sharp. "Where are you coming from?" You answer. "Where are you headed?" You answer again. Then the same question comes back, slightly reworded. Same destination, same explanation, but now you feel like you're being tested. Your voice tightens just a little. You hesitate, not because you're hiding anything, but because you're trying to understand what's going on. That hesitation? Officers notice it immediately. What many drivers don't realize is that traffic stops are as much about behavior observation as they are about the original violation. Officers are watching your hands, your eyes, your tone, your pauses. They're trying to build a quick mental picture of whether you're calm, nervous, evasive, or something else entirely. But here's where things can go sideways. Sometimes an officer starts reading too much into normal human behavior. Nervousness becomes suspicion. A delayed answer becomes evasive. And once that mental shift happens, the entire stop changes direction. Now imagine a second patrol car pulls up. That's when the dynamic changes. The first officer continues questioning you, maybe asking if you have anything illegal in the vehicle, maybe asking for consent to search. You decline politely. "I don't consent to any searches, officer." That's a perfectly lawful response. Calm, respectful, clear. But the tone sharpens. Why not? Got something to hide? And this is where drivers often make a mistake. They feel pressured to explain themselves. They start talking too much, trying to sound cooperative. They think if they just say the right thing, the officer will ease up. That rarely works. Because once an officer shifts into that investigative mindset, more talking doesn't calm the situation. It often feeds it. Now here's where the second officer matters. The second officer has been standing slightly back, observing everything. Not just you, but their partner. They're watching the pacing of the stop. They're noticing how long your documents have been held. They're hearing the repeated questioning. They're picking up on tone. And sometimes they step in. Not aggressively, not dramatically. Usually it's subtle. "Hey, we got what we need for the stop." Or, "Let's wrap this up." To you, it might sound like a casual comment, but in that moment, it can completely reset the situation. What just happened there is something most drivers never fully understand. That second officer isn't siding with you. They're enforcing procedure. Because traffic stops aren't supposed to drift endlessly. There's a legal boundary around how long a stop can last and what it can be used for. Once the original purpose of the stop is completed, like checking your license, registration, and writing a citation, the officer generally can't prolong the stop without additional reasonable suspicion. And sometimes, one officer sees that line being crossed before the other does. Let's talk about another scenario that gets even more tense. You're asked to step out of the vehicle. Now, legally, officers can order drivers out of the car during a traffic stop. That part surprises a lot of people, but it's well established. The reasoning is officer safety. But how that request is made and what happens next matters. Step out of the vehicle. No explanation, just a command. You comply. Slowly, carefully. Your mind is racing, but you keep your movements controlled. Now you're standing by the side of the road and the questions continue. Anything in the car I should know about? You give a simple answer. No, sir. Silence. Then the same question again, and again. At this point, a lot of drivers start second-guessing themselves. They wonder if they're supposed to say more. They feel like the silence is a trap. Here's the reality. Silence is uncomfortable, but it's not illegal. What matters is how you handle it. Now imagine the first officer starts circling your vehicle, looking inside, maybe shining a flashlight even though it's still light out. They're trying to spot something, anything, that can justify taking the next step. And then, the second officer speaks up. Hey, we're good here, no indicators. That's not just a comment, that's a judgment call. Officers are trained to identify specific indicators of criminal activity. Things like inconsistent stories, visible contraband, strong odors, or certain behavioral cues. But those indicators aren't supposed to be vague feelings. They're supposed to be articulable. And sometimes, one officer recognizes that those indicators just aren't there. That's when you see what I'd call quiet accountability. Not a confrontation, not a public argument, just a professional check that keeps things from escalating. But let me be clear about something, because this is where people get the wrong idea. You should never rely on a second officer to save you. That's not a strategy, that's luck. Your job during a traffic stop is to stay consistent, calm, and aware of your rights, without becoming confrontational. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Even when one officer disagrees internally, they're not always going to step in. Sometimes they stay silent. Sometimes they let the process play out. And that's why your behavior matters so much. Let's shift to a situation involving passengers, because this is where things often spiral. You're driving. You have a friend in the passenger seat. The officer starts asking them questions. Whose car is this? Where are you guys coming from? Now your passenger is nervous. Maybe they answer differently than you did. Maybe they add extra details that weren't necessary. Suddenly, the officer senses inconsistency. This is one of the fastest ways a routine stop turns into something bigger. Because from the officer's perspective, inconsistent answers can suggest deception, even if it's just two people remembering things differently under stress. Now imagine the second officer leans in slightly and says something like, "Let's just focus on the driver." Again, subtle, but important. They're redirecting the stop back to its original purpose. That's the theme you'll notice in these situations. When good officers step in, they're not trying to create drama. They're trying to keep the stop within proper bounds. Now let's talk about one of the most misunderstood moments during a traffic stop, when your documents are held longer than expected. You hand over your license, registration, insurance. The officer goes back to their vehicle. Minutes pass, then more minutes. At first it feels normal. Then it starts to feel off. What are they doing back there? Running your license, checking for warrants, verifying registration, that's all standard. But there's a point where the delay becomes questionable, especially if it's being used to fish for unrelated issues. Now imagine a second officer walks back to the patrol car, looks at the screen, and then walks back toward you. All right, you're good, just a warning today. That can be the difference between a prolonged, uncomfortable encounter and a simple, lawful stop. But here's the deeper layer most people miss. Officers aren't just evaluating you, they're evaluating each other. There's a professional standard at play, even if it's not always visible. And when that standard is upheld, it often shows up in these quiet interventions. Now I want to address something that might make some people uncomfortable. Not every questionable stop involves a bad cop in the dramatic sense people imagine. Sometimes it's an officer who's tired, overly cautious, or reading too much into a situation. Sometimes it's someone who's had a string of difficult encounters and is now seeing patterns where there aren't any. That doesn't excuse improper behavior, but it explains why these moments happen, and it explains why having another officer present can make a difference. Let's go deeper into the psychology for a second. During a traffic stop, officers are constantly making rapid decisions under uncertainty. They're balancing safety concerns with legal boundaries. They're interpreting behavior in real time. But human judgment isn't perfect. Bias, whether conscious or not, can creep in. Assumptions can form quickly. And once a narrative takes hold in someone's mind, it can be hard to break. That's where a second perspective becomes powerful. It interrupts that narrative. It forces a pause. It brings the situation back to something objective. But again, and this is important, you can't control whether that second perspective shows up. What you can control is how you present yourself, your tone, your pacing, your willingness to comply with lawful orders while still maintaining your rights. For example, when an officer asks for consent to search, many drivers feel like saying no will escalate things. But here's the nuance. How you say no matters more than the fact that you said no. I don't consent to any searches, officer. Calm, neutral, no extra explanation. That's very different from sounding defensive or argumentative, because tone is something officers pick up on instantly. And tone can either stabilize a situation or quietly make it worse. Now let's circle back to something I mentioned earlier, because this is where a lot of people get tripped up. That feeling that something is off during a stop. You shouldn't ignore it, but you also shouldn't react emotionally in the moment. This is where patience becomes your strongest tool. Because even if an officer is pushing boundaries, the roadside is not the place to argue legal interpretations. It's not the place to challenge authority in a heated way. That doesn't mean you're powerless, it means you're strategic. You comply where required. You assert your rights calmly. You avoid volunteering unnecessary information. And you pay attention, because details matter later. How long the stop lasted, what was said, what was repeated, whether your documents were held excessively, whether your request to remain silent was respected. Those details become important if the situation goes further. And sometimes, those same details are exactly what another officer notices in real time. That's when you see those moments where one officer quietly reins things in, not because they're trying to be a hero, but because they understand where the line is, and they don't want it crossed. And if you've never seen that happen before, it might surprise you just how subtle it can be. A single sentence, a slight shift in tone, a decision to end the stop instead of extending it. From the outside, it looks ordinary. But if you're paying attention, you realize something just changed. And that change can make all the difference.